When white opens the game with d4, black's most popular replies fight for central control while discouraging white from playing e4 on the next move. In this video, we're going to introduce knight f6, but in order to better understand what we're about to discuss, we should first mention that black's most classical reply is d5, fighting for a fair share of the center. White's most challenging continuation is the space-gaining c4, turning the game into the queen's gambit. White is trying to undermine black's central stronghold on d5. Capturing the pawn is known as the queen's gambit accepted, allowing white to gain a space advantage in the center with e4, among other interesting options. White has the positional threat of c takes d5, trading a flank, or non-central pawn, for black's central stronghold on d5. If black wants to reinforce the center, then the solid reply c6, turning the game into the Slav or semi-Slav defenses, is one important option to consider. Another sensible choice is e6, turning the game into the queen's gambit declined, also ensuring that black maintains a healthy central presence. When black opens the game with d5, it usually becomes clear what sort of opening will be played from the very first moves of the game. Instead of directly occupying the center with d5, black may indirectly fight for central control with knight f6. This position sets the stage for openings known as Indian defenses, which is an older term that covers the positions after d4 and knight f6. Knight f6 is a flexible choice, with several opportunities to transpose into different openings. Once again, white's most popular reply is the space-gaining c4. Sometimes black will try to avoid theoretical lines and play seemingly random moves such as h6 or a6. Against such unorthodox replies, white can play in similar fashion to more sensible, mainline choices. Knight c3, increasing control over the center, prepares to seize more central space with e4, building a strong three-pawn center. White can then focus on developing the king side, followed by castling with a comfortable game. Indian defenses typically involve allowing white to gain more central space, with the idea of vigorously counterattacking white's center from the flanks. A popular continuation is e6, supporting the center while preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop. If white decides to continue with knight f3, then black may consider b6, known as the queen's Indian defense, preparing to fight for central control by fianchettoing the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal. The disruptive bishop b4 check is known as the Bogo Indian defense, yet another opening with a solid positional reputation. Although this position may likely lead to an Indian defense, black may also decide to play d5, transposing into the classical queen's gambit declined. Knight f3 is a popular alternative to white's most direct continuation, knight c3. White is prepared to seize more central space with e4. Once again, black can transpose into more classical defenses with d5, but another important opening to consider is bishop b4. Turning the game into the Nimzo Indian defense. Pinning the knight on c3 prevents white from expanding in the center with e4, as this would simply lose a pawn after knight takes e4, taking advantage of the pinned knight. Instead of the classical approach of directly occupying the center with pawns, black prefers the hypermodern idea of observing the center from a distance, applying piece pressure from the flanks, leading to a rich, strategically complex battle. e6 prepares to activate the dark-squared bishop on the a3 to f8 diagonal. Another hypermodern approach is to activate the dark-squared bishop down the long diagonal with g6 and bishop g7. This idea can be played immediately, or sometimes black decides to strike in the center with c5, known as the Benoni defense, inviting white to grab more space with d5. Black is prepared to counterstrike against white's advanced center with either e6, leading to the modern Benoni, or play the thematic pawn break b5, known as the Benko gambit if black plays b5 immediately. Rather than striking against white's center with c5, black may decide to prepare a kingside fianchetto with g6. White can prepare to seize more central space with knight c3. Bishop g7 is known as the king's Indian defense, preparing to castle, intending to fight for central control with d6 and e5. Another sharp approach popular at grandmaster level is d5, known as the Gruenfeld defense. At first glance, this doesn't appear to be a hypermodern strategy as black is placing a pawn in the center, but the true nature of the Gruenfeld is revealed after c takes d5. Knight takes d5. allowing white to grab more central space while gaining a tempo against the knight with e4. Allowing white to gain a significant pawn center is not a decision to take lightly, but black's point is to exchange knights with knight takes c3. Beat takes c3. White has two pawns occupying the direct center, supported by a pawn on c3. The center may look quite impressive, but it's not without its drawbacks. The pawn on c3 is a backward pawn, so it can only be protected by pieces. The pawn on a2 is isolated from the rest of the structure, so it may also prove vulnerable to attack. We see black's hypermodern strategy take central stage after bishop g7, applying piece pressure against white's center, preparing to meet the natural knight f3, with c5. This sets the stage for a complex Gruenfeld struggle, which, like the other openings we mentioned, is given more attention in a separate video devoted to this defense. Notice that d takes c5 would be a blunder, allowing bishop takes c3 check, forking the king and rook. White has created a broad central structure, and black will vigorously counterattack the center with piece play, including moves such as knight c6, adding pressure against d4, and possibly bishop g4, pinning the knight, a key defender of the d4 pawn. The clash between hypermodern and classical strategies are debated at the highest levels of chess, leading to fascinating positions well worth exploring. We've mentioned several important pawn moves including e6, g6, as well as c5. It may surprise you that black can decide to avoid committing a pawn and develop another piece with knight c6. This highly provocative move is known as the two knights tango, or Mexican defense. The knight adds pressure against white's center and is preparing the central strike e5 if allowed. The most direct response is to lunge forward with d5, invading black's territory while attacking the knight. This approach demands energetic and accurate play to justify the two knights tango, but if black is up for this challenge, then white will have some serious questions to answer as well. Former U.S. champion Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, a supporter of the two knights tango, centralized his knight with knight e5, attacking the unprotected c4 pawn. His opponent, National Master John Potter, defended the pawn with the clever move e4, revealing the bishop's protection of the c4 pawn. It's important for black to avoid trying to win a pawn with knight takes e4, as this loses a piece to queen d4, attacking both of the knights at once. White's impressive-looking center is quite dangerous, but Grandmaster Benjamin played the important pawn break e6, adding pressure against white's center while preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop. The interested viewer is encouraged to explore queen d4, centralizing the queen, supporting the center, while also attacking the knight on e5, when black can provoke interesting complications after bishop b4 check. In the game, white decided to chase black's restless knight with f4, gaining more space but weakening dark squares on white's king side, provoking the retreat knight g6, adding pressure against the f4 pawn. At this point, it may have been useful for white to develop a piece while supporting the center with knight c3, but he decided to confront black's other knight with e5. After chasing the queenside knight all over the board, white attacks the other knight on f6. Grandmaster Benjamin centralized the knight on e4. Advancing so many pawns in the opening has created important weaknesses in white's camp. Bishop c5 is one idea, preparing to slice through the weakened dark squares. So white decided to challenge black's vulnerable knight with queen f3. Instead of immediately reacting to this threat, black decided to activate a third piece with the disruptive bishop b4 check. Instead of playing knight c3, self-pinning the knight, white decided to make the drastic decision of playing king d1, forfeiting white's castling rights, taking an all-or-nothing approach against the two knights tango. This ultra-aggressive approach can be dangerous to face, but with proper play, white is suddenly faced with some serious problems. Grandmaster Benjamin played the instructive reply f5, preparing to meet en passant with knight takes f6. As the center begins to open, white's exposed king may not be exactly thrilled with the outcome of this opening. Grandmaster Benjamin prepared to castle kingside, followed by challenging white's overextended center with d6, when black went on to win a nice game. Rather than lunging forward with d5 immediately, a more solid approach is to first develop a piece with knight c3. when black strikes in the center with e5. In the spirit of opening the game with knight f6 on the first move, the two knights tango is a highly transpositional opening, and white could turn the game into a variation of the English, usually reached when white opens the game with c4 on the first move, by responding to e5 with knight f3. White's most testing option is to seize more central space while gaining a tempo against the knight with d5. The queenside knight continues its dance with knight e7, when white may continue to expand in the center with e4. The knight completes its journey to the kingside with knight g6, supporting the central e5 pawn while also eyeing the f4 and h4 squares. By provoking the pawn to d5, this opens up the c5 square for black's bishop when black is prepared to castle, followed by solidifying the center with d6. Former world champion Anatoly Karpov, when facing the two knights tango, favored bishop e3, centralizing the bishop while preventing bishop c5, and preparing a possible queenside expansion with c5. He was prepared to meet black's most active response, bishop b4, pinning the knight, with f3, supporting the vulnerable e4 pawn while building a significant pawn chain on the light squares. This is an important line worth additional consideration, but white may decide to play more routinely with knight f3, activating the knight while adding pressure against the e5 pawn. The dark-squared bishop has two attractive options to make its presence felt: bishop b4, pinning the knight, or immediately taking advantage of the newly opened dark squares with bishop c5, pointing directly at white's kingside. One way for white to continue is with the modest bishop e2. Black typically reinforces the center at some moment with d6, liberating the light-squared bishop. It's generally a good idea to castle before playing d6, because if black decides to play d6 immediately, in this case it's certainly playable, but it does expose the king on the a4 to e8 diagonal. Imagine if black decided to play the alternative option of bishop b4. In this case, d6 would lose the bishop to queen a4 check, forking the king and bishop. Although d6 cannot be directly punished in this particular position, it does invite the additional option of b4, gaining more space on the queenside, forcing bishop b6, as capturing the pawn would simply lose this piece after queen a4 check. Instead of opening up a dangerous diagonal leading to black's king after d6, it makes sense to first castle the king. When after white castles in kind, black is now ready to comfortably play d6, supporting the center while clearing a path for the light-squared bishop. This leads to an interesting positional struggle in which white enjoys more central and queenside space, but black's position remains quite solid, especially as the dark-squared bishop enjoys an active role on the g1 to a7 diagonal. One plan of action for white is to expand on the queenside with moves such as queen c2, supporting the center as well as the knight on c3, preparing rook b1 and queenside expansion with b4. Black, on the other hand, may find ways to challenge white's broad center. One idea to consider is a6 and bishop d7, preparing to strike against the c4 pawn with an eventual b5. Adding pressure against d5 with c6 is another idea. And once the knight on f6 clears the path, f5 is a thematic pawn break, preparing to expand on the kingside. It's important for white not to get overly excited in trying to refute the two knights tango, as this attitude can quickly lead to trouble. In one master-level encounter, white decided to play knight e1, preparing to challenge black's dark-squared bishop with knight d3. Black anticipated this possibility by playing a6, when after knight d3, a strong response is bishop d4, adding pressure against the knight, a key defender of the e4 pawn. But in the game, black decided to play bishop a7. We once again see the potential dangers in underestimating the two knights tango. Placing the bishop on a7 may appear passive, but this piece remains quite active on the diagonal, pointing toward white's castled king. White decided to lash out and grab more queenside space with b4. As we learned from the first tango example with Grandmaster Benjamin, white needs to be careful before lashing out with committal pawn choices. White only focused on the positive aspects of b4, gaining more space on the queenside, neglecting to consider the space left behind, namely weakening the long dark square diagonal, allowing the strong reply bishop d4. Attacking the unprotected knight, pinning it to the rook on a1. When after bishop b2, black simply won a pawn with bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, and knight takes e4, when black went on to win the game from this superior position. When facing the two knights tango, we mentioned Grandmaster Karpov's choice of playing e4 and bishop e3 as one solid solution, but the ever-creative Grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk demonstrated another attractive idea, since black is intending to play knight g6. A dynamic way to challenge the tango is with h4, claiming space on the king's side and preparing to meet knight g6 with h5. This dynamic pawn advance is an important reminder that not all aggressive pawn advances are bad for white, but these are moves that should not be played carelessly. The original piece play so typical of the tango is demonstrated here, as black's best choice may be the bizarre-looking knight e to g8, preparing to activate the dark-squared bishop to either c5 or b4. Confronting black's center with knight f3 is one sensible choice, and white may also remind black that it takes two to tango with the creative queen d3. White centralizes the queen, preparing to meet black's idea of activating the dark-squared bishop to b4 or to c5, with the same reply, queen g3. Attacking the unprotected e5 pawn, as well as the space the dark-squared bishop left behind, the g7 pawn. Black's only way to stay afloat is with king f8, supporting the g7 pawn at the expense of forfeiting the right to castle. White should focus on achieving a comfortable game with either e4 or challenging black's dark-squared bishop with bishop e3. One thing white should avoid, however, is trying to win a pawn with queen takes e5, as this allows the instructive tactical shot, bishop takes f2 check, when white's king should reluctantly slide to the d1 square, as king takes f2, stumbles directly into knight g4 check, forking the king and queen. The two knights tango requires a flexible, creative mindset, which is why a crazy-looking move such as knight e to g8 deserves consideration. Grandmaster Ivanchuk's opponent, Grandmaster Christian Bauer, well known for his unorthodox treatment of the opening, decided to stop the h-pawn in its tracks with h5, preparing to meet bishop g5, taking advantage of the weakened g5 square while adding pressure against black's knight on f6, with the typical tango move, knight g6. Instead of playing e4, Grandmaster Ivanchuk demonstrated another instructive option with e3, helping restrict the activity of black's knight on g6, which may soon prove quite vulnerable. After black unpinned the knight on f6 with bishop e7, Grandmaster Ivanchuk played bishop d3. Black's position is starting to feel quite uncomfortable, and one attractive idea for white is to play queen c2, intensifying the pressure against black's kingside light squares, followed by castling queenside. White enjoys a comfortable position with active pieces, and black will struggle to harmonize his forces in any sensible way. The two knights tango is a provocative and somewhat risky opening choice, but there remains plenty of scope for creative and original play. As we conclude our initial journey introducing knight f6-based defenses, it's worth noting that white does not have to allow the tango dance that ensues after knight c3 and e5. A solid alternative is knight f3, allowing us to once again appreciate transpositional possibilities, this time after e6. Knight c3 allows bishop b4, transposing into the Nimzo-Indian. g3 can transpose into the Bogo-Indian defense after bishop b4 check. Or black may decide to transpose into Queen's Gambit territory with d5, turning the game into the Catalan opening. If white would prefer to avoid allowing these transpositions, another interesting option is a3, preventing bishop b4, preparing to play knight c3 and expand in the center with e4. d5 transposes into somewhat unusual Queen's Gambit territory, and an unlikely transposition into another Indian defense will likely occur after d6. Preparing to meet knight c3 with g6. Black is suddenly angling for a King's Indian defense type of position. One instructive line to keep in mind is e4, gaining more central space when black activates the dark-squared bishop on the long diagonal with bishop g7. When after the typical bishop e2, followed by both sides castling kingside, Black may transpose into a king's Indian defense down a tempo with e5, as black spent 2 moves advancing the e-pawn to e5. When in this typical king's Indian position, white has included the slightly unusual, but somewhat useful a3 move. Another tricky option is to play like Grandmaster Victor Bologan with rook e8. His opponent, Grandmaster Anish Giri, grabbed more central space with d5, provoking an exchange of pawns on d5, followed by knight e7, leading to an intense positional struggle worth exploring. If white decides to support the center with the natural developing move bishop e3, the point behind rook e8 is revealed after e5. The idea is to provoke the space-gaining d5. And as Grandmaster Bologan played in another game, the instructive central leap, knight d4. It appears that black is simply losing a pawn after the exchanges knight takes d4, e takes d4, and bishop takes d4. But this temporary pawn loss has opened the e-file for black's rook, allowing knight takes e4. When after the exchanges knight takes e4, rook takes e4, bishop takes g7, and king takes g7, white improved the position of his bishop while challenging black's rook with bishop d3. Grandmaster Bologan calmly retreated his rook back to the e8 square. After massive exchanges in the center, we reach a fairly balanced position, although Grandmaster Bologan was able to outplay his opponent and went on to win this particular game. Knight f6 is a flexible response against d4, often leading to Indian defenses such as the Nimzo, Bogo, Queens, and King's Indian defenses, just to name some of the more well-known options. We introduced the hypermodern strategy employed in several Indian defenses, in which white classically occupies the center with pawns, and black fights against this space advantage with piece and pawn play from the flanks. All of the defenses we mentioned receive greater coverage in other videos in our library, so you have no shortage of content to explore and enjoy right here on chess.com.